Today, we're gonna get a little dirty. So we're gonna talk a little bit about soil mediums and what type of substrate you should use, what's out there, what's in it. I mean, there's so many options and it's a little overwhelming, so we're going to break it down to something a little simplified to make it easy for you first-time plant parents. So first we're going to be talking about dissecting the ingredients of a pre-mixed soil mixture and just kind of what some of those ingredients are for and some of the pros and cons. We're also going to go over how to pick the right medium for your plant. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about mixing your own soil medium. Now I use the term soil loosely because not all plant mediums are made out of soil, but we will just kind of use it as the general broad term to describe what we use to pot our plants in. Now let's kind of dissect some of the ingredients a little bit. Most pre-mixed plant mixtures consist of three types of substrate. One being the water retention meat, if you will, of your soil medium or your plant medium. The second being a draining amendment, and then the third being a type of fertilizer or compost. Now I'm already messing up. This is not a good beginning. So let's first talk about the base of a mixture. Most common ones that you find are a moss material, which can either be a peat moss or a sphagnum moss. Another very common one is coco coir, which is made from the husks of coconuts. You also will find a lot of bark mixtures, like in an orchid bark, or most aroid mixtures typically have a lot of bark in them as well. Now these are very high water retaining materials. Each has pros and cons, and you can always look up individually what some of the pros and cons are for that material. The second material you often find in your planting mediums are very high draining materials. You might find perlite, pumice, vermiculite, sand are very common amendments that aid in draining and aeration of your soil mixture. Now, pumice, perlite, vermiculite, and even sand have all varying levels of water retention or drainage. So depending on your mixture, you might choose one over the other to ensure you're getting the amount of drainage you want or the amount of water retention you want for that plant. The third one is your fertilizer or compost, and this is where all of your nutrients come from, whether that be something organic like compost that you might make yourself or that you purchase, or it could be something animal-based like a fish emulsion, or a worm casting, which is basically worm poop. And let's not forget the manure. But these are all nutrient-rich materials that are going to help to feed your plants. There are also synthetic fertilizers out there, which you often find are those little balls that are mixed into the soil mixture, and those are slow-release fertilizers to help feed your plants, and typically those are synthetic or chemically developed. And then as far as the fertilizers go, it's a personal decision if you want to go on this synthetic or organic route. Obviously, organic do use animal products such as fish emulsion or worm castings. If you want something more on the compost and natural side, you could do a compost consisting of decomposing material that you can either do in your backyard or that you can purchase. Now, chemical and synthetic fertilizers are great if you want something slow releasing or a little bit more controlled, but they do offer a chemical or synthetic material. Now, picking the medium is going to all depend on what you're planting. Going to your average big box garden center, you're going to notice there are so many choices. What is the difference between organic, not organic, between a cactus mix and an orchid mix, or what's moisture control, what's the difference? Now these are all pre-mixed mediums that are basically recipes of all of the mediums that we listed above. For example, a cactus mix would probably contain a lot of sand, a lot of pumice, a lot of rocks to ensure that it's replicating the type of conditions that a cactus would normally be living in nature. So those will be very high draining, a lot less water retention, and have that same texture that you would probably find in the desert. An orchid mix, for example, might contain very heavy amounts of bark with some fertilizer and maybe small amounts of a moisture retaining material to ensure that it's replicating the conditions that an orchid would live in, which, since they're epiphytic, they live on trees, it would make sense that the roots would actually favor being in a very woody substrate. Now, when you're looking at the all-purpose mixes, you're probably going to find a peat base with some perlite and a slow-release fertilizer in it. Probably the most common combination of ingredients you're going to find in a general-purpose potting mix. The differences between indoor and outdoor typically will be in the amount of drainage that substrate has. Outdoor will contain a higher amount of water retaining materials since there's a lot more opportunity for that material to dry out. They might be a little heavier in the peat, they might have more water retention, more fertilizing. Where an indoor mixture, because it is in a condition where the climate is controlled, would probably be a little bit more on the draining side. Now, there's a lot of other ingredients that you can amend your soils with that we haven't even brought up. Some of those examples might be activated charcoal. Now, you can always amend your soils however you would like. So if you would want a all-purpose potting medium because it is so easily accessible, but you need a little extra drainage, you could always add perlite to it or orchid bark depending on what type of plant you're planting. Let's talk a little bit about making your own soil. So let me show you one of the recipes that I use as my general use recipe, and then a couple of things that you could always do to amend it for your plant. Alright, so here I have a couple of the ingredients, and these are probably some of the most common ingredients that I use when I make my soil. This is a pre-mixed cactus and succulent mix, and as you can see, it's very sandy. It has some, I believe this is perlite. There's a little bit of bark in here, and this also contains lava rock. So this has a very high draining mixture. Now, these here are also some ingredients that I use, and this isn't the proportion that I normally have my soil, but you can at least see the idea of what I put into my soil. This here is a cocoa coir, which is basically made from coconut husk, and I find to be a great alternative to peat moss. So if you want to avoid using any type of moss, this is a great alternative. It is very water retaining. Typically these come in bricks, and you add some water to them and it will expand and create this texture. Next to that here I have some charcoal, which helps to add some more carbon and nitrogen into the soil, so it's really great to add if you have something that is very foliage forward. And because of the carbon, it also helps to keep the soil clean, and it helps to keep the pH balance for some of your plants. It's also very helpful when it comes to draining, and you can use that when doing some of your more sensitive plants. This is sphagnum moss, and typically it comes very dried, so you would also have to add water to it. But this is great if you have a plant that requires very moist soil or likes to be wet. It's very highly retaining in water. So when you do water sphagnum, it will puff up and retain a huge amount of volume, and it will take an average amount of time for it to dry back out, but it's also very easy to gauge how quickly it's drying out, because you can tell visually when it starts to get very crispy that it's time to water it. This is perlite, and perlite retains some moisture but not enough for it to really make a substrate on its own, but it's a great addition to any substrate because it helps with the drainage and aeration of your soil. You might notice over time that as you water your plant, especially if it's old soil, that it starts to get compacted. And the addition of perlite will help to prevent that, so that it will keep the soil loose and free flowing, so when you water, the water can drain through. This here is worm castings. This is worm poop, essentially. So this will help to fertilize or feed your plant very organically, since this is something that will happen very naturally in the soil. As the worms live in the dirt, they will shed their waste, and that becomes composted material for your plants. And the last thing I have here is an orchid bark mix, which is actually just small chunks of fir wood. You might also find a lot of orchid bark made from pine or different types of trees. And this can come in various sizes. You might find larger chunks, which you would typically use for orchids. But I do like to get the smaller chunks for when I'm amending my soil, because I also find it to be malleable and able to work around in smaller pots. So when you have an idea of what your recipe, so to speak, is for your soil mediums, and you're able to work out what proportions you want for your plants, then you can just make your own soil by creating your own mixture. So once you have everything in here that you want, then you can just stir it all up. And again, your proportions can change however you want. I'm going to tear apart some of this sphagnum moss a little bit so it's in smaller chunks and can be more even throughout my soil. Now, if you're planting a plant that would like a more airy mixture, for example an aroid or an epiphytic plant of any type that typically will live on trees, you may want to have a heavier recipe of orchid bark or orchid bark mix or any type of wood mixture to replicate the idea that this plant is living on a tree. If you have a plant like a succulent or a cactus that typically comes from the desert or a drier condition, you might have a heavier perlite mixture, or maybe add sand to create the idea that it is living in a desert-like condition. If you have a plant that typically loves moisture, or that lives in the understory of rainforests where it's used to seeping up and having a really soggy bottom, a very soggy mixture, then you would probably go very heavy on the sphagnum or cocoa coir in your mixture. So the great versatility of mixing your own soil is going to help you in customizing it and making your plant happier, because you have something that is custom to your plant. Now, obviously this is such a broad topic, and there's so many other things that you can add and that you can take away and that you can do. So it's very important just to understand the plant that you're planting, so you know what conditions it requires, and then you're able to customize your soil to that. And of course, there's a lot of other information that I didn't cover in this video, and I would love to cover it in a future video. So if you can think of anything that you want to know, drop it in the comments, and I will work my best into putting that into the repertoire of videos that I will be coming out with. Alright guys, that's all I have for you today. I hope this was helpful. I really appreciate you sticking through this video to the end. And if you did so, it would be great if you could subscribe, because that helps us creators so much. So please subscribe, and I will see you guys next week. Thanks. Bye.